Hello everyone, my name is Shirley, and today we're going to be looking at some tips, tricks, and talents for arms warriors in Antorus the Burning Throne. Today we're going to be going over every boss and my preferred talent setup and legendaries, as well as some few tips for each boss. This whole guide will be pretense that it is in a heroic context, because I have not cleared Mythic entirely, so hopefully you guys can get some uses out of these. I will say that these are just my opinions and findings in the new raid, so if something else works, great, comment down below, I'd love to hear about it. Anyway, getting right to it. Garothi Worldbreaker is our first boss. The preferred talent setup, this is with tier 21, the new raid set, is Dauntless, Trauma, Fervor of Battle, In for the Kill, and Opportunity Strikes are your standard single target talents. Now, I would recommend you run Alia's Stone Heart, that is the Execute Ring, and Archivon's Heavy Hand for your two legendaries. If you don't have both of those, hopefully, you can get them. But if you can't, then any stat stick will be fine, really. Kill Jane's Burning Wish would be fine. Really shoot for those. You could also run the helmet, the Blade Storm helmet, if you wanted to. But standard single target legendaries and talents for this fight. As far as tips go, there's a couple of things you can do on this fight. Depending on how your raid strategy is set up, when you get your bomb debuff and you have to run out of the raid, if you're not stacking for that 100% of the time, and just waiting for the third phase to do that, you can actually run it off to the right of the boss, way past his arm, and still be in max melee range for his hitbox, and still keep 100% uptime on the boss, because his hitbox is way bigger than it looks. You don't have to lose any damage, you can move back in and continue attacking. Another thing is, when you pull the boss, you can pop your cooldowns, go through the motions, save your second battle cry for the Apocalypse Drive phase, and this is when you're going to Warbreaker both the arms, pop battle cry, and Blade Storm, and then about the time that ends is execute phase for your preferred arm target. Now, this is just a bit of cheese on each of the arms, but this is for, parsing guide. So, the last thing, tip-wise, is you can actually parry the explosion knockback after the Apocalypse Drive. You don't literally parry it, but if you pop Die by the Sword, you can survive the hit. Now, to do this, depending on your gear level and how much health you have, you need to run back a little ways, so you want to be in max melee range because it has damage fall off. You pop Die by the Sword, and you can eat one of these explosions. Now, your healers might get angry at you for this, but, whatever. So, you only have time for one of these, because the chances of Die by the Sword being back up after the first one for the second one's pretty slim. So, I would save this strat for the second knockback, because this is usually when your team is going to lust and you're going into execute phase, so you're popping your second potions and you're good to go. And that's it for Garothi Worldbreaker. Next up, we have the Felhounds of Sargeras. My preferred talents are, once again, pure single target, that is Dauntless, Trauma, Fervor, In for the Kill, and Opportunity Strikes, and I'll be using the exact same legendaries, Alia's Stone Heart and Archivon's Heavy Hand. Now, tips on this fight is you really want to be on the Shadow Dog the entire time, on Heroic anyway. And it's simple. You spread out for any fire debuffs, stack for all the shadow debuffs. There's not any reason really to leave the dog. When he does the orb pull-out thing, you can position yourself at max melee range on the other side of the Shadow Dog. You don't actually have to run away from the boss ever. So you can always be in melee range and just fight that pullback. Now, you do need to watch out for your tank debuff. So when he gets the debuff that's going to fear him, you can go inside that little circle hitbox without being in front of the dog, so you don't get hit, and eat that. And if it does ever fear you or whatever, you're a warrior, so you can just Berserker Rage out of it. That's about it for Felhounds. Next up is the Antoran High Command. Now, this fight is just pure cheese. It's just AoE. I would recommend Sweeping Strikes, Avatar, Titanic Might, In for the Kill, and Ravager for this fight. And any AoE trinkets you can have, Moonglaves, stuff like that, maybe Gorshalash's Legacy, probably butchered that name, and the legendaries, there's a couple of options you could run on this fight. You could actually stay single-target legendaries with Archivons and Alia's Stoneheart, because a lot of the time you're not hitting all the targets, and you're getting the added benefit of the reduced MS costs on Archivons for the sweeping strikes, so when you are cleaving, it's just going to cost less, which means you have more rage for whirlwinds. Or you could run a more AoE-focused talent setup. I would really recommend the Bladestorm helmet. That would be the Great Storm's Eye for the Ravager uptime, instead of, say, Archivons. The Execute Ring, on the other hand, I think is always a fantastic choice in any situation, so you probably won't replace that. You could also run the Legendary Pants, that gives you more Colossus Smash uptime, or also the Whirlwind Belt. Either one would be great. But I would recommend either the gloves or the helmet would be my top two choices for this fight. So as far as tips on this fight, save your cooldowns on pull. Do not pop Battlecry and Avatar and all that stuff on pull, because the first set of adds are going to spawn in roughly 5 seconds after the pull happens. So you want to wait for that. Now be watching your global cooldown, because you don't have much time at all to AoE the 2 Bladestorm adds, because they'll charge out. So as soon as they go, you want to drop that Worldbreaker on them, and then drop your Ravager, and then pop all your cooldowns. Now, there's a little trick with Ravager, if you didn't know, it doesn't do damage immediately like Bladestorm does, so after you Warbreaker, you want to drop your Ravager and, say, your Moonglaives, and then about half a global cooldown later, that's when you pop Battlecry and Avatar, because that's when the first tick happens, and it gives you that extra little bit of uptime, and then you're going to Sweeping Strike your first MS, and then probably, Whirlwind after that, depending on procs. So you really want to cleave that down. Watch for, interrupts on the Pyroblast ad, because it can kill people just one shot and then get comboed out if they step on a bomb. Anyway, another thing is you always want to be looking for executes on this boss, because they're a single target increase for you on the boss itself. So anytime the Whirlwind adds come back in, or the Pyromancer gets low, you want to be executing him to cleave onto the primary target, being the boss. And it doesn't matter if the ad doesn't have Colossus Smash, as long as the boss does, because you're getting that Sweeping Strikes benefit. So always be looking for those executes. And last tip for this boss is when the boss transitions and he goes into his pod and the next one spawns, you've got a little bit of downtime here, and if you don't have a Colossus Smash ready to go for that next boss, your damage is better spent on the old adds, the 2 Bladestorm adds, if they're still up. So usually, in our group anyway, they'll be right at about execute range. This is perfect, because as they're running over to the next boss, you can cleave them both with executes, and hopefully you'll have Colossus Smash on them from previously cleaving them. So this gives you just a little bit better uptime where your damage is well spent, and then when you get a CS proc, then you can charge the next boss, drop that Colossus Smash, and go to town on him. And that's it for High Command. Next up we have Eonar the Lifebinder, the tower defense cheese fight. Honestly, to parse well on this fight, it requires basically your entire raid group to just let you do your thing, because only one person's really going to do well in this fight, because it's just a joke. It's pure AoE. I would run the exact same talents on this as High Command. That would be Sweeping Strikes, Avatar, Titanic Might in for the kill, and Ravager. Your 2 preferred legendaries. Now this one I might switch up from the gloves to the Whirlwind Belt, or even the helmet, the Bladestorm helmet. I would always run Alia's Stoneheart once again, and this is because most of the time you're hitting 3 or more targets if the adds live long enough, and then the belt is going to be really useful here for like burst AoE situations with Warbreaker every minute, but also the Bladestorm helmet fulfills that same role, so either one that you have works just fine. As far as tips on this fight is just hold your CDs for groups, make sure that every time you get Warbreaker up, you're not just dumping it on like 2 Felguards. You want to wait for the big AoE groups that spawn, and you can do this immediately when they spawn before they even move. Just drop it, pop cooldowns, go to town. Maybe take Shockwave on this fight, depending on your raid group, if you're having trouble keeping the adds grouped together, because you are using Ravager. You don't want them to move out of it, obviously. Last thing is make sure that your tank is hitting the great big adds before you get to them, because they will basically one-shot you with their melee. Speaking out of experience there. That's about it for Eonar. Next up we have Portal Keeper Hasabel. The tips on this fight depends on if you're, well, which portal group you're going into, or not at all. My red group keeps me down the whole time to help clean up the ads, so, you know, it's not much different if you're going up in the portals either. This fight's a little bit misleading, I guess, because there's a bunch of ads. You figure you take AoE talents, but that's not actually what I would recommend. I would recommend you go full single target build on this, with T21 in mind anyway. So that would be Dauntless, Trauma, Fervor, In for the Kill, and Opportunity Strikes. And then your two legendaries would be Archivon's Heavy Hand and Ollie's Stone Heart once again. Now, the reason for this is because the ads do not live that long, and when they do spawn, they're staggered spawn, which means you can't ever get a really good uptime on your Worldbreaker, which means that any sort of like pure AoE build is kind of getting wasted because you don't have Colossus Smash on everything all the time. So I use this because you're still getting the Fervor build with input. It's just more single target damage, but also since Whirlwind's getting buffed from T21 and Trauma, you know, supplements that, then you can cleave the ads down just fine as long as you have, you know, 1 or 2 ranged DPS helping you, and that's literally all it takes. So I'd go pure single target for this and cleave the ads when you can. So after like the opener, your second set of burst window with Battle Cry, usually you're going to have your portal ad spawning. That's when you want to save your Worldbreaker and, you know, drop it on at least 3 things if you can, you know, hopefully more. But depending on how good your AoE is and your raid team, you might not get much uptime at all on these. But, you know, try to line up your Battle Cry with when the portals are spawning. That's about it. Another thing you can do is when the boss does Collapsing World, which is the big AoE black hole thing, you can actually get free rage in this window, and now this is great for running the Fervor battle build because you're usually a little bit rage starved anyway. So when the boss does it and the tank has to move the boss to the other side of the room, you can continue to hit the boss, but instead of just following it over, you want to kind of max range out during the blackout phase, and then when the tank drags the boss all the way over, you can cheese this for an extra charge because it doesn't take any time to max melee range, hit the boss, and then literally turn around and jump back because the boss is moving at the same time that you jump back. This will put enough distance between you and the boss to get in a free charge, and you can do this on every single time that the collapse happens, which means you're just getting that much more rage to spend on Whirlwind, you know. That's about it as far as tips for Portal Keeper Hasabel. Next up we have Imonar the Soulhunter. This is the bounty hunter fight. Talents I would be using on this is exactly the same, pure single target, Dauntless, Trauma, Fervor, In for the Kill, and Opportunity Strikes. The 2 legendaries I'd be using would be Archivon's and Ollie's Stone Heart once again. Not a lot to say about this fight, it's just your pure single target fight. Couple of things you can do to maintain or maximize DPS here is try to, you know, yell at everybody that that keeps the sleep canister in the group. Not really though. The second phase, when the Legion ships come and target people, if you do get targeted by one of these things, you can actually just take it to the side of the boss, because usually your red group is going to be stacking kind of perpendicular to the bridge. So you can take your debuff right to the side of the boss and maintain 100% uptime as long as nobody's in the way of it, of course. And if somebody's slightly out of position, you know, just tell them on Discord or whatever to, you know, get out of the way because they're about to get knocked back. And this helps maintain DPS because there is that break in the fight for the 2 transitions. You want to have as much uptime as you possibly can. Another thing you can do is possibly take defensive stance actually on this fight if your healers are having a hard time keeping up with the traps on each of the transition phases. You can take D stance since you're not losing any DPS, just sit in it, you're taking less damage so you don't die from some guy stepping out of a bomb next to you. It's pretty good. That's about it for Imonar. Next up we have Garothi. This fight is actually pretty fun on Heroic anyway. The preferred talents on here are you've got a little bit of options, but I'm going to kind of go over each in their own right. So I'm going to take single target talents here with a little twist. I'm going to take Trauma and Fervor, and in for the kill normally, but instead of Opportunity Strikes, we're going to be using Ravager. And the first talent I skipped over on purpose. You can either take Dauntless or Sweeping Strikes. Now this one kind of depends on your raid group. Normally, you're just going to take Dauntless and use it for the extra rage, but if your raid group is having a hard time killing the adds quickly enough, or if they come together after the first transition phase, you can take Sweeping Strikes and cleave them both, or if the third add lives long enough to get to the boss, you can take Sweeping Strikes to cleave executes onto the boss. Now the boss takes 99% reduced damage during that phase, so you're not using it for the damage itself off of Sweeping Strikes, you're using it to apply the Executioner's Precision debuff from your artifact weapon to the boss. So this is only worth taking if you know you can get at least 2 executes in on the adds to cleave onto the boss each time. Otherwise, it's just a wasted talent. You're losing rage out of this. So it's up to you if you want to try it. It requires a little bit more positioning and timing, I guess. It depends on your raid group. Dauntless is still always a safe bet on this fight, though. Next, the other reason why we're using Ravager instead of Opportunity Strikes is because you're going to be getting a little bit less rage on this fight from this, but when the adds spawn, they take 90% increased damage, and it ticks down. So you want to save your Ravager Battlecry window for when the adds spawn every single time, otherwise this isn't worth using. But as soon as they spawn, you're going to drop your Ravager and Battlecry on them every single time to get that increased burst damage, and this will make up for the rage loss of Opportunity Strikes. So that's why you use it. My preferred legendaries would be single target. Once again, I'd be using Archivon's Heavy Hand and Alia's Stone Heart. Archivon's is super useful in this fight because you're using Ravager. You get a little bit extra rage. It's great. There is a couple of things you could do to maximize DPS on this fight. So you want to save your first battle cry when you start the fight, because the boss will start at high energy already, and when he reaches 100 energy, that's when the adds spawn. So you want to save that window for the adds. And then after that, as long as you're hitting it right on cooldown, you can go ahead and use Battle Cry when the ad spawns, and then when you get back on the boss, in a minute when it comes up, he'll be roughly at 50 energy. Now you can actually Battle Cry Ravager again just on the boss in between, but you have to have really good timing with this. It has to be on cooldown. So you can do that, and then as soon as he hits 100 energy again, you'll have about a 2-second gap when your Battle Cry and Ravager will be coming back up for the adds. So as long as you're on the ball with this, hitting it immediately, you can actually Battle Cry Ravager on the boss as well as the adds every single time. And that's my tips for Kingaroth. Next up, we have Varamathras. He's the patchwork fight of the raid, and I would recommend pure single target for this guy. Dauntless, Trauma, Fervor Battle, In for the Kill, and Opportunity Strikes, as well as Archivon's Heavy Hand and Alia's Stone Heart for your 2 preferred legendaries. Tips on this fight is not a lot. Kind of depends on how your raid group is doing the fight. First and foremost, if you get the knockback debuff, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, as long as your melee groups are stacked tight where they should be on its markers, the way that you can really do this safely is walk towards the boss. So everybody in melee should be in roughly max melee range. What I mean by that is on the edge of the hitbox. So you have the room to walk in between the melee group and the boss. This will eat the debuff and knock you back, but it won't knock you so far back that you get the Alone in the Darkness debuff. So this will just knock you back behind the rest of the melee. You can come back in and continue to attack without getting that debuff tick. Second thing is when you get the Plague debuff, you really want to wait till about the last second, 1 or to 2 seconds of the debuff going off before you want to leap out into the darkness away from everybody. The debuff will trigger and then charge back in. Now, this is for two reasons. One is just to maximize your DPS uptime on the boss, but also because we don't have really reliable defensive cooldowns all the time. Die by the Sword is on a 3-minute cooldown, so you only got one shot with this, really. So you really don't want to be out there any longer than you possibly have to, because you can get comboed out and just die. It's also worth considering taking defensive stance for this if your healers are having trouble, getting through, or if your timing, you don't want to chance it so close and you want to walk out sooner, then you could take defensive stance to help mitigate the damage. Either way, that's about it for Varamathras. Next up, we have Coven of Sargeras. Now, this is the new Mistress Sazine of the raid, and what I mean by that is it's just not friendly to melee in any way. There are a couple of talent options you can run for this fight. Mix it up, try them both, try all of them. It just comes down to personal preference and also how your tanks position the bosses in the raid encounter. And it also comes down to luck of the draw as to what Titan debuffs you get. So my preferred talents would probably just be normal single target talents, which would be Dauntless, Trauma, Fervor, In for the Kill, and Opportunity Strikes, and also the two single target legendaries being Archivons and Alia's Stone Heart. But you can also run a more AoE-centric build with this fight. Now you could run Sweeping Strikes, Titanic Might, and actually Rend on this fight. Also In for the Kill and Opportunity Strikes, and if you're using the AoE build, then I would prefer the Great Storm's Eye, which is the Blade Storm helmet, and once again, Alia's Stone Heart for your second legendary. Now, you can do this build, but it's up to your tanks to position the two bosses as close as they possibly can before they get the damage immunity buff. So what you're going to do this is you want to stand right in between the two bosses and cleave them as much as you possibly can. So you're going to take Titanic Might for that extra uptime on Colossal Smash, so you can whirlwind them both, but also if you're using the Blade Storm helmet, you can spec, actually misspoke earlier with Opportunity Strikes, you can actually spec Ravager on this if you want, as long as the bosses are close enough together. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend it because you're going to lose a lot of uptime with Opportunity Strikes if you're using Ravager and not cleaving both bosses every minute. It's just a really bad positioning fight. You can also use the Sweeping Strikes on the adds, depending on how your tanks move the boss around. If he's following each of the adds, then it's kind of worth using Sweeping Strikes to, cleave both the boss and each of the add spawns. But it's also luck of the draw as to what you get. Tips for this fight is definitely be in max melee range as much as you possibly can. Like, I can't stress that enough on this fight, because the one boss shoots at the little blades, they're really hard to see, and they can knock you back. Max melee range gives you enough time to see the debuff coming out. Also, when, Golganeth, the lightning debuff comes out, and if you touch anybody, you just instantly die. So a lot of times melee have a bad habit of really getting clumped up on each other when they're not supposed to be. So if you're at max melee range all the time, you don't have to worry about stepping on somebody and really just pay attention to the floor. Also is when the storm comes out and the patches of safe space are on the ground, say one doesn't spawn next to the boss that you're currently attacking. Look around the room quickly, and if there is one next to one of the other bosses, you can actually heroic leap during the storm onto a safe spot to continue uptime, because this fight really favors ranged DPS. So anything you can do to be hitting something as much as you possibly can, you should do it. Next up, we have Aggramar. This fight, I would be preferred pure single target, once again. Dauntless, Trauma, Fervor, In for the Kill, and Opportunity Strikes. And the two single target legendaries being Archivons and Alia's Stone Heart. There's a couple of things you can do on this fight to, really maximize your potential. One thing you do want to watch out for is when playing the Fervor build, you really want to watch your Whirlwind Cleave on the adds when they come in. So when they're coming in from the CC break, you can actually kill them if you're not paying attention to your positioning, and that's a big no-no. So you don't want to cleave the adds, but the big tip on this fight is the Taishalak technique, when Aggramar does his combo thing. You want to back off as far as you can in max melee range, still hitting the boss of course, for when the Flame Rend comes out, because when he does this, if you're in max melee range, the knockback will put you far enough back that you can charge back in. This means that you get 2 free charges every single time that he Taishalak techniques, which is a lot of rage to use throughout the fight. Another thing is, after the second charge back and he starts casting his giant AoE Fire of Doom, still hit the boss, don't panic, and then at the last second, you're going to heroic leap outside of the AoE, so you can maintain as much uptime as you possibly can. And then another thing about jumping out is you want to position yourself off to whichever side the big ad is going to spawn on that your raid group has decided to kill first. So in our case, from the bridge looking in, it's always going to be on the left side. So I know that every time that comes out, you're going to be leaping directly to the left-hand side. That way you can immediately come back in right where the ad spawns. You just want to pre-plan your positioning on this fight. And that's pretty much it. Another thing is when the big ads spawn, actually, and you're hitting them down, you can actually cleave the boss himself for a single target gain on the ads. Now, Aggramar is going to take way less damage during this phase, but it's not made for hitting him. You're going to cleave him, literally the spell cleave, to get the Whirlwind buff for the Fervor build, so you can do more single target DPS on the ad itself. That's pretty much it for Aggramar. And last but not least, we have Argus the Unmaker. Now this fight, you could run a slight variation on the talent on, but I would recommend pure single target again, with Dauntless, Trauma, Fervor of Battle, In for the Kill, and Opportunity Strikes. My 2 preferred legendaries would be Archivons and Ollie's Stoneheart. The one variation of talents on this fight is you could take Sweeping Strikes instead of Dauntless, but I don't really think it's worth it because you're only getting the benefit out of it during one phase on Heroic when all the ads spawn, and even then it's only if the tanks position them close enough together with the melee ad for you to cleave. So I really think Dauntless is the way to go for this fight. But as far as tips on this fight, as soon as in phase 1, when he starts casting Cone of Death, you can move immediately. It's probably a no-brainer, but just as soon as he starts casting it, you can move, so you never have to get hit by this. Now, he'll drop buffs as well that he targets on people. Now, whichever buff you get doesn't really matter, actually. The lightning buff is the mastery buff, if you want to know. So if you could prefer one, I would take the mastery buff, which is mastery crit, which goes really good with our set bonus. But it doesn't really matter, honestly. Just make sure that you're grabbing the same buff each time. You've got like a 4-second-ish window to refresh this buff. You want to stack it as high as you possibly can. Just make sure that you don't overwrite with the other one and lose your stacks. That's the main thing. But either way, depending on which one's closer, go for the mastery one if you can. That's about it. In phase 2, you want to wait, if you get the bomb debuff, either of them, to leap out at the last second, so you can just maintain maximum uptime. You know, don't panic. You got like a 10-second window before it goes off, so you can really, keep a lot of damage on the boss. You're not just standing in the corner. You might also have to die by the sword for it as well, because it's pretty hard. Depends on how close you are to the other bomb. If your healer's topped you off or not. Just watch your health on that. In phase 3, you always want to be hitting the physical debuff ad. Now, he spawns in the exact same place every single time. So he spawns at the foot of where Amanthul, the Titan, is sitting. And that's slightly off to the right side of where the tree spawns, if you want some more context. So you can pre-plan, always go straight to him when the ads spawn. Now, you don't want to pop Battle Cry as soon as he spawns, if you've got it up anyway. You want to save for when the debuff actually triggers on him. You'll see it on your debuff bar. And then you can pop your cooldowns and go to town on him. And you want to DPS him all the way to 100%. Now, after he's dead, you can move on to any of the other ads. Now, if you've got a preference here, I would say either the Shadow or even the Fire ad here, depending on what trinkets you're using. So out of the new raid, you had the Seeping Scourge Wing and Gorshalak's Legacy are the two, kind of go-to trinkets if you've got them. The Seeping Scourgewing does shadow damage, the other one does fire damage. The fire one's pretty inconsistent as to when it procs, so I would really prefer you go on to the shadow one. Also, it goes well with your artifact weapon. The Corrupted Blood debuff is shadow, so preferably the shadow one second. After that, doesn't really matter. Look for executes. That's about it. In Phase 4, it's just dodge the things that are falling, and then you really want to not die. I know how stupid that sounds, but death is a resource in this fight, but you really want to hold out as long as you can because you're losing uptime, and if you're hitting the boss, that's just way more DPS, obviously. But you do usually want to save your die by the sword until execute phase. So this is about the time you'll be getting Titan Forged, and your raid team's gonna lust. As soon as he starts, doing the bombs and all that stuff, you want to save die by the sword for execute phase, because if you die during execute phase with lust up and everything, this is a huge DPS loss. So you really want to save your CDs for that last possible moment. This is gonna, send you up the meters. And that's about it. Thank you for watching the tips and tricks guide for Antorus the Burning Throne. If you liked what you saw or heard, please consider subscribing. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Peace.